Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my series of reading my TBR shelf. It's not really a series, it's just more that I am trying this year to read books that I actually own versus buying new books or going to my library. Not that I have anything against those, but I have a lot of books just sitting on my shelf that I am trying to actually get through, so that they're not just taking up space with a one day maybe I'll read kind of a vibe. And because I am anticipating downsizing in a year or so, and so I'm trying to actually go through my personal library and make sure that when I get to the point where I need to decide what to keep, I actually know which books I like and which books I probably won't ever read again and can go find a better home elsewhere. This is the second book that I'm picking up this year. It is called The Widow of the South by Robert Hicks. Another book I don't actually know where I got this from. Don't know anything about this author. Know nothing about this book. So we shall see if I like it. It is set in America in the Civil War. It looks like it might jump back in time and be bookended by, looks like 1894, and then it jumps back to 1864. That's actually the exact same way that the last book that I read, the Heaven and Earth grocery store, if you've seen that video, also is bookended by future time. Okay, so The Widow of the South, though, I'm trying to find the summary. Ooh, we have a nice little map. I think it's this way. Nice little map. The Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. This is a map of a portion of the battlefield. You probably can't read that at all, but I'm good to be able to reference that as I read. Okay, so I pulled it up on Goodreads to give you all the summary. Tennessee, 1864. On a late autumn day near a little town called Franklin, 10,000 men will soon lie dead or dying in a battle that will change many lives forever. No one will be more changed than Carrie McGavock, who finds her home taken over by the Confederate Army and turned into a field hospital. Taking charge, she finds the courage to face up to the horrors around her, and in doing so finds cause. Out on the battlefield, a tired young Southern soldier drops his guns and charges forward into Yankee territory, holding only the flag of his company's colors. He survives and is brought to the hospital. Carrie recognizes something in him, a willingness to die, and decides on that day in her house, she will not let him. In the pain-filled days and weeks that follow, both find a form of mutual healing that neither thinks possible. It's a debut novel, and it's based on a true story. Epic novel of love and heroism set against the madness of the American Civil War. And it has an overall 3.78 rating, so not too shabby. I'm trying to see, it was published 2005. Okay, not a new book, but looks like it does have quite a few good ratings and reviews. And it just sounds like a pretty intriguing story. I'm doubting there's a romance going on. I'm guessing that's not a subplot, which is fine. I'm not like, every book has to be romance. So I'm curious what we're gonna get into. So I'm gonna go start reading, and then I will check in at some point. I don't like to do these videos as spoilers or to give much away about the plot, mostly because I don't want to spoil for anyone who might read the book, but I may change my mind if I end up not liking it and I need to like rant to get through it. Hopefully I like it. I'm anticipating I'll like it, and I will check in at some point. Okay? So I finished part 1 of The Widow of the South, and so I want to share some of my initial thoughts on this novel thus far. For whatever reason, I've ended up reading books about the Civil War right now. Before this, I reread Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. It's a coming-of-age story of a boy who grows up during the Civil War, and so it's not focused on the experience of being a soldier or of being directly in the violence of the Civil War, but it is about a boy who, he starts at age 9, and so his whole childhood is interrupted and is framed by the American Civil War and his experiences seeing his brothers go off to fight, how it shapes how he views his family and his community and his place in the world as he's growing up with all of this violence that's happening across the country and that has, torn families apart. And then, of course, I picked up The Widow of the South, and then I'm going to be reading Uncle Tom's Cabin shortly for another project I'm working on, which is not set directly in the American Civil War, but a lot of people contribute that novel to the abolitionist movement and reasons for why the American Civil War came about. Whether or not that's true, there are quotes, right, of Abraham Lincoln saying that Harriet Beecher Stowe was the little woman who caused the Great War. That being the case, I decided to do some research on the Civil War to share as some context for these books. And so I just did some quick searches on some Civil War statistics, and the American Battlefield Trust website talks about the Civil War being America's bloodiest conflict. Nearly as many men died in captivity during the Civil War as were killed in the whole of the Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands died of disease. Roughly 2% of the population, an estimated 620,000 men, lost their lives in the line of duty. Taken as a percentage of today's population, the toll would have risen as high as 6 million souls, which is just insane to think about that number, and to think about that number in the context of a war within a nation, within citizens of the same nation. It is hard sometimes for me to comprehend what American society and politics and culture was like that led to the cause of the Civil War. Like, America's not great right now in the year 2026. And at the same time, I find it really difficult to imagine being able to pick up arms against somebody who I know, like a neighbor down the street, or even, someone from, name a state, right? Like, it is hard to wrap my head around the point at which things move from conversation and from verbal debates and political divides into violence, all-out war. I don't know, it's hard because it's like, I think some people would probably say that America's in its own version of a civil war right now, and that people are dying because of the political divide going on right now and the ideological divides going on right now in the country. I don't want to minimize any of that, while also not minimizing the Civil War itself and the fact that, hundreds of thousands of men died in this conflict. The Widow of the South specifically follows the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, during the Civil War in the year 1864. And I did some quick research on it just because I wanted to know the historical context that's not necessarily provided in the novel, right? Like the fictional aspects of it, because while it is set in a historical place and time and there are real historical figures, it's not as if it's also a history book. So I just figured I'd fill in the gaps for myself. The Battle of Franklin, Tennessee happened on November 30th, 1864. We have the army of General John Bell Hood, who's leading a 30,000-man Confederate army. They were hoping to divert William Sherman's army as Sherman's army was making their way into the South, making their way down into Georgia and Florida. And so Hood's goal was to destroy Sherman's supply base in Nashville, Tennessee. But Sherman deploys his own 30,000 strong army to protect Nashville, then takes the rest of his men further down the Atlantic coast. We end up with this conflict between the 30,000 Union soldiers and just over 30,000 Confederate soldiers within Franklin. I was reading that it's called like the bloodiest 5 hours of the Civil War or something. It was not the battle with the heaviest death toll, that's Gettysburg, but it is crazy to read the statistics of this battle and to read the description in this book of this battle where these generals just like throw bodies at each other until someone ends up calling it quits. You have 30,000 men on both sides, and at the end of the day, you have estimated casualties of over 8,500 men, over 6,000 of those being Confederate soldiers, because the way the battlefield was laid out is Union soldiers kind of snuck through during the night and were able to entrench themselves. And so the Confederate Army just essentially threw waves of men at these entrenched Union soldiers, so thousands of them were just taken out in this advance from artillery and then from bullets, right, as they're just advancing and advancing. The description of it is honestly horrifying because you just have this battlefield covered with bodies to the point where you can't even see a blade of grass. Men are just like walking over other men, whether or not they're dead or wounded. They're just having to continue charging forward without knowing if they'll survive it, right? And some of them like maybe not even wanting to survive it because it's so atrocious. But they don't have a choice, right? They're just commanded to go, and so they have to go. And it's just like, it's hard to read, honestly. It's hard to read, and it's just terrifying sometimes, like to like read these characters' feelings and to read the description of this brutality. And like, I don't know, I'm just rambling at this point. So let me do my thoughts on the book itself so far. I have finished part 1, like I said, and so I've been introduced to our main cast of characters. We have Carrie McGavick, who is our main female protagonist. She lives on the Carnton plantation. She's married to John McGavick, and her home has been repurposed by the Confederate Army to serve as a hospital during the Battle of Franklin. We have a Sergeant, Zachariah Cashwell, who is our perspective of the Confederate Army, and a Lieutenant Nathan Stills, who is our perspective of the Union Army in this battle. And then we have, interspersed with those 3 perspectives, a cast of other side characters. And so we get a few of the residents of Franklin as this battle is starting and then progressing. We get some other people on Carrie's side, a couple of her slaves, her husband, who are also having their perspectives shared and their experiences shared, as well as interspersed views of real historical people who were at the battle. So like General Hood, right? We get to see him and kind of his strategy play out as he has no choice but to try to cut off the Union Army, but he's at a disadvantage. And we see him like walk through the strategy of trying to plan out this battle, trying to scout the lay of the land, goes to the Carnton plantation and designates it as a hospital, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it is interesting to read from multiple characters' perspective because we can see the battle kind of from all sides then. Carrie herself is distanced. She doesn't actually see any of the fighting. She only sees the aftermath of it. But we see her as she's planning for all of these casualties to come in to her home, especially as a woman who has lost 3 children. And so she's going through her own grief and struggling to process her own thoughts of death and how particularly she reconciles losing 3 children with her faith and questioning God and questioning the hope that she has and the belief that she has in the strength of prayer. Because no matter what she did, no matter how hard she believed and how hard she prayed and how hard she tried, she lost 3 of her children. And now she's in this situation where She's going to have her home opened up to wounded men, dying men, and she has to come face to face with death all over again, and her own mortality and the mortality of people around her all over again, and how is she going to deal with that? Book 1 is where we have finished the battle itself, and then most of the book is presumably the aftermath of the battle and what happens at the hospital that they have at Carnton Plantation. I did want to read the last chapter of book 1 just to give you an idea of what's happening. So this is November 30th, 1864, twilight. It was said you could walk across the battlefield upon the bodies of the fallen and not once touch the ground. Others have described the dead as being stacked like cordwood, or like sheaves of corn, or like sacks of meal. By different accounts, the ground ran with rivers of blood, or it was stained with blood, or it was blood. The wounded moaned, their teeth chattered, they screamed, they howled. Again, it all depended on who was talking. For many years afterward, their survivors wrote beautiful letters and memoirs that always stumbled when they came to the task of describing the dead. On the morning after the battle, in a town of nearly 2,500 living, there were almost 9,200 casualties. There were no words to describe such a sight, and within a month, the dead had either been buried on the battlefield in shallow graves or been hauled off to the new Union cemeteries in Nashville and Murfreesboro. In other words, they quickly disappeared out of sight. There were thousands of dead men lying on the Confederate side of that battlefield, and perhaps 1,000 Union dead on the other. To that, add a few thousand horribly wounded men on both sides, and then there were a few hundred men that were missing, that were never again found. Then add to them the men who were so disfigured and broken that they were of no use to their armies anymore, who went home bearing the physical and mental scars of that battle for the rest of their lives. Lives often cut short because of what had happened at Franklin. The dimensions of the violence began to emerge, its measurements a tidy table of dead and wounded. But it is impossible to see it all fully. It would drive a man mad to apprehend the whole tragedy, to know every effect and consequence, to know the names of every good man and woman, every genius and every saint, who was never born because their lineage petered out there on that rise at Franklin. It would be like looking into the face of a Gorgon, or for that matter, the face of God. The thing to remember about the dead, stacked up like wood or like sheaves of corn, whichever you prefer, is that they're just flesh, and rapidly mortifying flesh at that. The mind reels, it refuses to look closer. The dead are objects, they're litter to be removed. And yet, if one did look closer, as a few rare and intrepid young men did, there was more to see. More than the flesh, the blood, the numbers. Such facts disappear from memory, but the memory of certain faces can be eloquent, even in death, if one looks closely enough. I saw scores of wounded men who had put their thumbs into their mouths and had chewed them into shreds to keep from crying, wrote a young Mississippian to his girl, coward-like as they lay exposed to the merciless fire. Franklin was the only battleground I ever saw where the faces of the majority of the dead expressed supreme fear and terror. Their eyes were wide open and fear-staring, their very attitude as they lay prone upon the ground with extended, earth-clutching fingers and with their faces partially buried in the soil, told the tale of mental agony they had endured before death released them. The Confederate dead lay on one side of the entrenchments, the Union dead on the other, and in the night, the living Union troops quietly left town. They left town even as the Confederate commander planned his morning attack. A number of Confederates wandered the field, looking futilely for their friends, taking in the full extent of the horror that lay at their feet. It was only then, later in the cold night, that they noticed the silence. It was not a total silence. There were still the moans and pleading of the dying in the air. But the aggressive sort of noise that had throttled their ears for nearly 5 hours, from the hour before twilight into the moonless night, the gunshots, the report of cannons, that noise had dissipated to nothing. The Confederate general heard of this, and he wept. The next day he marched toward Nashville to complete what he had begun. Within months, the Confederacy would surrender. Yet the Battle of Franklin was not over. Though the cannons and the wagons had rolled out of town, for some, the fighting had just begun. Some fought for their lives in the cold rooms of makeshift hospitals. Others fought to remember what Franklin had been like before November 30th, 1864. Still others fought to hang on to whatever vain hope or benighted purpose had brought the war into the town, on the theory that to abandon that hope and purpose would be to render the killing meaningless and the whole affair a cosmic joke. And some fought to quash everything that remained of such sentimental notions. And that is the end of book 1. And then just a few other initial thoughts right now. I am having a hard time resonating with Carrie and her grief for her children. I don't know if it's because I don't have a personal experience with such a loss, and so I'm struggling to resonate with like the depressive state she's in and some of her thoughts on death and some of her thoughts on religion. So I'm interested to see how her perspective continues to play out. As hard as aspects of this book are to read, I am enjoying the novel, I'm enjoying the writing style, I'm enjoying the characters, and seeing everybody's journey through this very short period of time that feels kind of infinite to a lot of them because it is so intense. This is the time that none of them will ever forget an experience. None of them will ever forget for a variety of reasons, but it will shape them and impact them in ways that they will still be uncovering decades from now. I'm excited to continue reading and see where this story takes us. So I will check in probably after I finish book 2 of it and let you know what's going on. Pardon the wet hair. I woke up just a couple hours ago and just showered, but I had to stop and talk about some of my thoughts on part 2 of The Widow of the South at this moment. If I'm honest, after book 1, there was a point at which I was considering not continuing reading the book. I liked the writing style, and the first book was fast-paced enough that it kept you interested and it kept changing characters' perspectives, and so you stayed really involved in the storyline. But I wasn't resonating with a lot of the characters. I didn't feel like there was not enough depth necessarily to the characters that we were exploring that I was interested in their own lives. And so after book 1 ended and after the battle was over, had a moment of where are we going to go from here questioning and considering if I was invested enough to keep reading. Benefit is, because of this video, I told myself I needed to keep reading to get to a point where either I definitively can make the decision that no, I didn't like this book, or ideally I did like the book, or at least enjoyed it enough that it wasn't a waste of time, even if it wasn't something I would recommend to other people. But book 2, oh my gosh, I feel like epiphany is too strong a word, but there are definitely moments where I'm like, oh, I get it now. I understand the story and why the characters were set up the way they are. So I don't think book 1 was bad. I've reclassified it as a long prologue, not in a sense that it's boring or drawn out, but it is definitely set the stage for over 100 pages. And then book 2 really gets us into the stories of the characters and why they are the way they are and how this experience has changed them for better or worse. And I want to talk specifically about Carrie and Zachariah. There are some other characters set up in book 1 that I mentioned in my last part of my review, but they don't feature as heavily. We really are focused on the dynamic between Carrie and Zachariah at this point in time. And one of my epiphany moments was realizing why maybe it's called The Widow of the South, because she's not actually a widow. Her husband is in the story, alive and well. And we finally get maybe a glimpse into the title of the book when Carrie and Zachariah are having a conversation and he asks about her husband and straight out asks her, do you love him? And her response is not a straight yes or no. She ends up going into a lot of her backstory and how she grew up. And Mariah, who is her she's a slave, like her companion slave, essentially. Mariah is someone that Carrie grew up with and came with her when she got married to John and moved to Tennessee. And Carrie tells Zachariah about growing up with Mariah being her only friend. And Carrie has this idea that the world revolves around not necessarily her, but her family. There's definitely the plantation she grows up on is the center of her universe. Everything in her mind was kind of made for her. It was perfect, it was beautiful, and she's the center of it. Until one day, Mariah has a baby, and Carrie feels this huge sense of betrayal because despite being extremely close with Mariah never divulges to Carrie who she had this baby with, or that she was even going to have a baby, is kind of how Carrie tells the story. Carrie, all of a sudden, it's a light bulb moment of, oh, other people have their own lives going on. I am not the center of everyone else's universe. And so she decides, as her own form of rebellion in that betrayal, she decides she's going to start wearing black to show that I understood that none of us knew anything and that what was proper was arbitrary and meaningless. Then I just never stopped wearing it. I got used to it, like we always become accustomed to things. I thought I looked good. I thought the boys I saw every once in a while thought I might be pretty in my black. I learned we can become accustomed to anything, which is why things can seem to us like they're in their proper place when they really aren't. We just don't pay attention after a while. And so she's been wearing black for 20 years at this point. Has nothing to do with her losing a husband. It is just the stance that she has taken against the world, essentially, that she feels as if she can't trust other people anymore. There are secrets that she will never know, right? She isn't the center. She doesn't know everything. Everything's not created for her or revolving around her. And that's how she's lived her life. And when she loses her children, she sinks into a pretty deep depressive episode for a while. And at this point in time, especially with the Civil War going on, there's no idea of mental health, right? Psychiatry doesn't exist here. There are no psychologists. And so the doctors just prescribe laudanum to a lot of the women to deal with nerves and to deal with depression so that they just go through a drugged stupor in life. Carrie is prescribed laudanum, but she never takes it. What she does instead is pours her daily dose into a perfume bottle, and she saves that perfume bottle because she overheard the doctor one day saying, if you take enough, you'll overdose. Carrie kind of flirts with that idea for many years while she is struggling to figure out how to move forward in life with 3 dead children and wrestling with the meaning of life, and now not just betrayal from other people around her, but betrayal from God himself is how she frames it. That she did everything. She was a good mother. These were innocent children, and yet they were still taken away from her. And when she meets Zachariah, he is severely wounded from the battle. He wants to die. He's decided before the battle, his way of psyching himself up essentially is, I'm not going to make it. I will die. And he makes peace with that. And so when he goes into the Battle of Franklin and he gets wounded and he's still here, he's just like, I'm going to die. It's just going to take me longer, but please let me die. And Carrie just refuses to let him die. And it's an unspoken argument between them for a while until we get to a point where finally Zachariah says something and Carrie's like, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to read the first time Zachariah sees Carrie so you can understand some of the mindset he's in. So he's lying on the floor because, like I said, he's severely wounded. And he's just lying on the floor of this room filled with other wounded men. And Carrie comes in and it reads, I had no power to do anything. I was pinned to the floor by nervousness and pain. Her eyes sat wide apart on her face, and her bottom lip was thick and swollen like a doll's, and she might as well have been a picture on a wall in a castle 1,000 miles away. She was so beautiful. Right then I wished to God that he would show me no more of the world that I could never have or touch. No more beauty for this old boy. I felt the world receding from me every moment she stood in that room, glaring at that big piece of human kindling and the Spaniard playing possum on his shoulder. She reminded me of how much I had lost and how little I had and how far I'd gone down the road to the next life. I wanted her to leave the room only because I didn't want to have such thoughts and so that I could sink into sleep. I hated that she made me think these things, and at first I thought this meant I ought to hate her rather than the man who had aimed his rifle at my leg. So that happens before Carrie makes the decision she's going to save his life. He ends up losing his leg and is very, rightfully so, resentful towards her for a good portion of the book after that. And then, like I said, they start having a conversation. And I'm going to read this part about Carrie's response to Zachariah as someone who thought she wanted to unalive herself, and then she sees someone who is waiting on the precipice of death and just wants to fall over, and she realizes that she could never have done that. She could never have actually taken that final step herself. I had my own obsession, my own little project. The man, Cashwell, was as foreign to me as Eli was to Winder. I can't explain why I needed him around. He held no attraction for me, and I sometimes doubted if any man could. In the beginning, I believe I was shocked to find a person, in this case a man and a soldier, who wanted to die. Once I had thought that I wanted to die, but I could see from watching Cashwell that I was only a pretender, a histrionic fool. Cashwell took no pleasure from the thought of dying, not that I could see, and that's what made our difference clear to me. There had been a perverse pleasure to be taken from contemplating the big vial of laudanum I'd kept hidden from the world, and it was that contemplation that had sustained me and, if I'm not wrong, that had kept me alive. If what I could become, my potential for transformation, was as severely limited as Becky's, at least I knew I could be transformed by death. The possibility of an option in a world empty of options had been liberating. But Cashwell, he wanted no more options. At times, I'd come to his bedside and he'd ignore me for a while, but then we'd talk a little. He never said it, but I thought I detected the weariness of a man, a person who had seen all the options of life. Of late, these options had been brutal and unfair and ungodly. It thrilled me to stand next to a person who possessed a record of experiences unimaginable to myself. If he felt the pressure and weight of being alive, I felt its mysteries when I was with him. It was a relief to know there were still mysteries. So for all intents and purposes, Carrie sees Zachariah as her savior, and Zachariah also sees Carrie as his savior, but their feelings about the matter are not mutual. Carrie is very grateful, or at least curious, about Zachariah, and Zachariah is just like, I wish you would go away. I wish you would have left me alone. And we get a glimpse into his perspective a few pages later. As soon as I quit crying about the leg, though, I started taking stock of the other things I was missing. And the one that made me the angriest was that I knew, lying in that bed, that I was not any longer the man who had picked up that flag and run into the Yankee works. I was not the sergeant who knew every damn thing about fighting. I was not that man. I was a man who would not ever again think to pick up a flag like that. It was not that I had become afraid. I was not and had never been a coward. No. The thing was, I cared about living now and taking care of my own business and nobody else's. I had been ready to die, and that had made me strong and fearsome and in control. But now, I wasn't ready to die, and I didn't see as how I would ever be ready to die again. I'd been ready to die even as the surgeon sawed my leg off, and I'd been ready to die in the days after when the pain seemed like it was demanding that I die. But now, like I said, the fuss was over and I was going to live. I didn't know how to live, exactly, but I knew I had to figure that out now. I'd become like any other man, like I had once been before the war, before the fighting, before the charge. Living did not seem like a gift. It was a heavy weight, but it was all I had anymore, and it didn't matter how low I sunk as long as I stayed alive. This is what I thought, and it made me angry and sick. There was nothing worth dying for anymore, and that made everything around me seem smaller, including myself. The whole world was cheap and mean, and I was going to be cheap and mean along with it, just so long as it meant staying alive. It made me common. I was common again. And then finally they start having a conversation about their feelings towards each other and how they have both changed each other's destinies, if you will. Carrie is essentially demanding answers of Zachariah for, like, why did you awaken this will to live in me? Tell me about your time as a soldier. Tell me who you are. Give me answers. Zachariah doesn't know how to respond. And so they're sitting in this room, and we get this description. The sun was setting just then, and that low orange light seemed to light up every individual piece of dust on the windowsill. I'd never noticed the dust before, and I stared at it like it was something important, like there was something there. It didn't do anything. The back of my head hurt, not like I'd been hit in the head, but like there was something wrong up in there. It tingled like my arm did when it fell asleep, and the blood had just begun to rush back to it. That part of my head felt empty, except for the tingling, and I felt as scattered as the dust on the windowsill. I had no ground to stand on, no place from which to say, this is who I am, this is what I am, this is where I'm from. I could be one of any number of men. I had been any number of men in my life. The man who had rushed the barricade and who had killed other men was as dead as the boy who watched his mother ride off with the black-coated preacher. What could I say about him, the soldier and killer, except that he had lived? What could I tell someone like Carrie McGavick? I knew what she was asking, and the truth was that I had never thought much about what it felt like to kill other men. Killing was just another part of not being killed, at least the way I had experienced it, the unavoidable other side of the coin, and it had been my own willingness to be killed that had made it possible to kill. That's what I told myself every day after every bad night of sleeping on the cold ground, hugging my rifle. It was a puzzle, though, and how could I explain that to this woman who had probably never been threatened in her life? I knew that death had been in this house, but it had snuck up on her unannounced, and to me, that was some kind of mercy. She didn't have nothing to do with it, and I wasn't one of those folks who thought sickness and death was some sort of punishment for crimes against God, for sin. Sickness and death was like termites in the forest, just something to take care of the dead wood, and nothing special at all. And then the last passage I want to read, which is basically where I stopped. This was the last paragraph that I read before I decided I needed to set the book down and come film some thoughts. So we're back in Carrie's perspective. That night I told Zachariah everything I could remember. I never talked to anyone like that. He was captive, and he irritated me in a way that made me want to talk to him even more, to make him see, to make him understand me. I thought I could talk to him like this because he would go away eventually and take with him what I'd said. But that wasn't it entirely. He was so strange, and he was unafraid of me. He was a sinful, flawed man, and those sins lay upon his heroics as accents of color on a plain quilt. He was not like the rest of the men in gray. His sins were what emboldened me, because I knew I could not be judged by him. His sins drew me in. Hopefully those passages gave you a little glimpse into the character dynamic that I'm appreciating. I am almost halfway through the book at this point, and I am very much sold on it so far. But at this point, I will just keep reading and maybe check in at the end of book 2, or who knows, I might just pick up the camera and film a little bit here and there. Hello again. I am just about to start my workday, but I needed to pop on and get some things off my chest with The Widow of the South. I am on such an emotional roller coaster with this book. I thought the last time that I checked in with you all that it was going to be pretty steady going, and I figured there would be interest, right? And there would be conflict between the characters, but I did not anticipate the very sharp turns that the book proceeded to take. All I have to say at this moment is Carrie is absolutely nuts. I am shocked by something that you learn about her husband. And there was a scene in a smokehouse that honestly I almost couldn't stomach to read. I will give the author credit that this book definitely makes you feel like you're in the 1860s, in the sense that he drops little descriptions and comments here and there that make you realize they don't live in the modern day. They don't have modern day amenities. Like, this is just normal life for them. He'll describe a ceiling in passing as having mold spots, or he'll describe a character's breath as smelling like rotting hay, because personal hygiene was very lacking at this point in time. And in general, there's a lot of references to sweat and dirt and grime and bodily fluids that just give you a visceral experience of living at that day and age, and the circumstances, and like, this is what clean was to them, even though we don't at all consider it clean today. So you just kind of, you feel like you're there, and you can like feel the griminess on yourself sometimes. So I'll give the author credit for very good descriptive writing. I'm a little upset with the journey he's taking me on emotionally. So that is all I have to say at this point in time. I still haven't finished book 2. At this point, this review is going to be extremely long, so it may be 2 parts, or you may just get me at the very end of the book with some final thoughts. So see you then. All right, folks, I have finished The Widow of the South. I'm here to give my opinions. We're going to keep this short and sweet because I have rambled far too much so far in this video. So I wrote some notes for myself and closing thoughts about this book to share with you all. I want to start with going back to the title of the book. In book 2, there was a moment where I thought Widow of the South, the title of the book, was based off of an experience that she had when she was younger, and from then on she decided to wear black, that kind of symbolized her separation from the world and like her betrayal of things happening to her in her life without her consent or her knowledge. I want to focus on the word widow itself. As I was writing my closing thoughts down, I was going through like the definitions of a widow, and to me, when someone says widow, I think of a still living wife of a deceased spouse. Pretty straightforward. But then I was thinking through the connotations of that word, and I came up with someone who has lost a loved one, someone who is in mourning, or someone who is alone. And to me, that third one is actually more about what this book centers on, is someone who has experienced a type of loss or a type of betrayal and therefore feels alone in the world. And that is kind of what sends Carrie down this path of depression and mourning for her children, because there was nothing she could do to prevent their deaths, and she thought she could as their mother, right? She thought she could pray, and she thought that her belief in God and her love for her children would mean that they wouldn't die. And when that didn't happen, her anger turned into her separating herself from everyone and closing in on her loneliness and like isolating herself from other people. And throughout book 3, this theme became evident to me, with the story ultimately coming to a place of saying we're not alone, and no matter the cruelty we face in life, we're never an island of one. There's always a reason to live and to remember those who have passed on. And this is where I do want to read one section of the book on page 375, where Carrie is kind of sharing these epiphanies that she's had about herself and about her approach to life. The second epiphany was much simpler. I simply remembered what Mariah had said about the dead in that field. They all alone. I see a lot of men. That was my sign from God. I am alone on this earth. How often had I thought that very same thing rocking in my room above the entryway, imagining that I had been abandoned by my own children. On my knees in angry prayer, I had said those words as both a statement of fact and an accusation. But I knew now I was not alone on this earth. It hadn't come to me in a rush. There were no angels involved. I had just kept living, and living had shown me that there were other things in the world, like a one-legged sergeant who listened to me like I was the most exotic thing in the world, like a boy who could die on the floor of my house thinking only of how to get word to his mother, like a husband who would do anything for me, even if it meant angering the man who held his debts, and so many other things I had observed just by sitting and living and keeping my eyes open. I was not alone. I was surrounded by the living and the dead. I'd always been that way, and it was a relief to finally know it truly. So by the end of this book, we've gone through the battle, which isn't the focal point in terms of, it is book one, right? It is setting the stage for what's happening in this town of Franklin, but then it is quickly forgotten in the sense of it's just the surrounding landscape, but we're very much focused on Carrie and what is happening within her little plot of the world. And so book two is just the time at Carnton when it's a hospital and as she's caring for all of these wounded men, and it's just, that is her world for so long. And then when that world ends, and Franklin is starting to recover from the Civil War, what does that look like? And what is Carrie's place now in this larger world? And we see her going from creating this world of just her and her children's bedroom in a rocking chair to now she's got her house, and now she has this town, and she's trying to figure out where she fits in being someone who is alive and is connected to other people. And what does that mean? I had a lot of conflicting thoughts trying to put on paper what I would rate this book and how I would recommend it. I kept flipping back and forth between would I rate it good because it felt like it was historically accurate, or would I rate it good because I liked the story of it and the novel of it and the fiction of it. The author doesn't romanticize the war and the fallout and the prejudice of the Civil War. The war doesn't end and people live happily ever after. There is some pretty nasty depictions of what cruelty people are capable of and the racism that is still rampant throughout society at this point in time. But if I think about recommending this book because it doesn't romanticize things, then I had the question of, is historical fiction good because it is based in fact? To me, that kind of seems like a bare minimum for this genre, because the very idea of being historical fiction is you should have a well-researched time and place and history for your readers to connect with, and therefore it needs to be factual. So then I kept thinking about, how do we judge historicity in a book anyway? At least the personal experiences and the conflicts that these characters are feeling, because we can be factual in the number of deaths from a battle. We can be factual in the place the battle happened in. We can be factual in the war that it was a part of and who fought in it. But we can't really be factual about people's experiences of it and how that battle continues to shape them and invade their lives for decades to come. That's where the fiction part comes in. So does good mean then that the book should reflect the universal human experience in a believable manner on top of being historically accurate? But then, is it even important for readers to be able to relate to characters? I have lots of questions. No clear answers at this point in time. And I kept processing and kept thinking, and I got to another question of if objectivity is even possible or should even be a goal when writing from individual perspectives. In this book, we as the reader are taken into more of an omniscient place, in that we get chapters from Carrie's perspective where she's thinking about her own self-image. We get chapters from Zachariah, who is meant to be her foil in the story, and we get to see how he views her. And then we get other people in Carrie's lives. We get her slave Mariah, we get her husband John, we get some others throughout the community. And so we, as a reader, have a more, I don't want to say objective view of Carrie, but we have a lot of different perspectives and more of an outside looking in, as well as the inside looking out of Carrie, who is presented as the hero of our story, while she herself is also not objective about what has actually taken place. What I also find interesting about it is there are other people who have been with her the entire time, like her slave Mariah. But Mariah doesn't get a big voice in this story, despite the fact that in some ways I would argue she did even more than Carrie, particularly when it comes to Carnton being a hospital and caring for the wounded. Carrie kind of just chose her favorites and focused on them, and Mariah kept the household running and did like significantly more, but gets a very minor role in the story and a very background role in the story as being there to support Carrie, not being there as her own independent person. To circle back around to objectivity though, my next question was whether objectivity is important when portraying a society's bias and racism. And this was a particularly sticky point of the book for me. I could go along with the fictional aspects and the inserts of fictional characters to round out Carrie and to make her that hero and to give her foils. I struggled more with some of the depictions of Black individuals in this story and slavery and racism as a whole, and how those plot points and those characters were used in contrast to Carrie and to the white Southern people in the book. I felt like there were unnecessary uses of stereotypes involved. We never see any personal growth in the white characters to view their now freed slaves as anything other than slaves. They make this assumption at some point that they're free to go and do whatever they want, but they make no arrangements for that. They don't offer help. They don't treat them any differently. Some characters have a sorrow for, like, I will never be seen as the master again, and that's as far as it goes. They just like move on with their lives. And Carrie particularly just never even offers for Mariah to leave. She doesn't want Mariah to leave. She's become very codependent on her, and so she just never brings up the topic. When she does, there's this interchange between Mariah and Carrie of Mariah saying, where would I even go? Because I have no one. I've known no one. I have always lived with you, and that's your fault, Carrie. And Carrie, like, doesn't offer to do anything about it. She's just glad that Mariah feels like she has nowhere to go and is stuck here, whether she wants to be or not. All that to say, some of those moments I just felt uncomfortable with. That's where I like kept going back to my original question of, do I rate this book well because it, to me, didn't seem to romanticize those feelings around slavery and Black people? Because I'm sure we can validate that that's how society viewed African Americans at that point in time. And at the same time, I was like, it was so derogatory and unnecessary at certain points and stereotypical that I was like, you could have taken at least a little bit of creative license to not make this so egregious. At the end of the day, I just have a bunch of thoughts. And I came across a question and answer at the end of the book, and the question asks the author why slavery is not talked about a lot in his book. And he gives an answer which, to me at that point in time, after going through this huge spiral, was enlightening as to why I probably felt the way I did. Aside from Mariah and Carrie's relationship, the book doesn't really address the issue of slavery. Was that a conscious decision on your part? The author gives a long response, But in summary, he says, while I've read much non-fiction about the Civil War, the political conditions, Southern history, and slavery, I was trying to write neither a military history of the Battle of Franklin nor a study on slavery or states' rights. I wanted to simply tell a story about a handful of folks caught up in this epic drama that Walt Whitman called the defining point in American history. That gave me the answer I wanted, which is he was telling a story about characters set in a particular time in history because he wanted to be able to show the impact of that point in time on these people. It wasn't to engage in some of the larger narratives going on at that point in time. It was very much a couple people and very focused on them and their lives. In summary, I have decided if I give this book a star rating, it's probably going to sit around a 3.5 because the writing was really good, the characters were really good. I was extremely invested in this story, emotionally so, and I thought it dealt with some really good themes in very interesting ways and made me think, obviously, as you can see. I don't want to give it any higher than that because there were also things I didn't like about the book, and I was very conflicted in terms of like book 1 was kind of like whatever, I could have stopped reading, and then book 2 I thought I knew where it was going, and then I was like really torn on some of the things that were happening that I felt were just completely unnecessary, and then book 3 I was like, okay, we're getting back to like a more mellow flow at this point in time, which is interesting, and then other things happened where I was like, well, what is going on? And things ended up wrapping up, but it was just some of the things were odd to me. It was like not my favorite book, and I don't think I would actually reread this book again, which is also partially why I'm not going to rank it super high. I'm also just knocking off probably like another half star, if you will, for I think this book, you can tell in some respects, was written 20 years ago. We can tell an honest, truthful story of the Civil War, but we don't have to be so like leaning into that racist language and racist stereotyping in order to do that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say about The Widow of the South. 3.5 stars. I think it would be an interesting book to pick up if you're looking for something to read. I wouldn't say go run to your local library to get a copy immediately. And with that, I will close out this video, and I will see you in the next one when I show you what else I'm going to pick from my TBR shelf. Thank you so much for watching.